Welcome to Machiavelli and the Ivory Tower. Our guest today is Dr. Fiona Cunningham, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Fiona, we know what a busy time of the academic year this is, so we are really grateful that you were able to make time in your schedule to speak with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah and Hanna.
So let me jump right in here with our first question, which is maybe a scene-setting question. As we know, China has been engaged in nuclear modernization in recent years. And I wonder, Fiona, if you can start us off by telling us a little bit about what this modernization looks like, maybe with respect to, the kinds of capabilities that China's developing and the kinds of capabilities that they're fielding.
Sure. So there's obviously been a lot going on with China's nuclear modernization in recent years, and I think different scholars and analysts have different ways of sort of cutting up how we can sort of make sense of everything that's been going on. For me, I like to basically divide up the changes into four buckets, which is the size of the arsenal, the diversity, its accuracy, and its readiness. And I do this because I think that these buckets help us to sort of think about how to connect the capabilities that China is developing to what they could actually do for a state's nuclear operations. So I'll go through each of these dimensions in turn. The most obvious, I think, headline grabber for China's nuclear modernization has been the size. I think some have described it as like eye-popping. But China has already, I think, doubled its nuclear arsenal size from being in the kind of mid 200s in about 2020, 2021 to more than 500 today by the Pentagon's estimates. The Pentagon has also been estimating that by 2027, China is going to have about 700 warheads fielded, 1,000 by 2030, and this is the big eye-popping number was 1,500 warheads by 2035. But with an important little asterisk to it, which is that if this expansion continues on its current trajectory. And I do think that's an important if, because it could plateau, but it also could potentially accelerate perhaps even further. The second, I think, big area of change is the diversity of China's nuclear arsenal. And this is happening not just at the kind of theater range, so systems that can reach targets in China's region, but also at the intercontinental range, so things that can reach the United States. So one thing China has done in terms of the diversity is it now fields an operational triad. So the PLA Air Force got back into the nuclear business, regaining a nuclear mission for its H-6 bomber. But the range of that bomber is going to be fairly regional unless it is refueled in flight. The Pentagon also declared that China's ballistic missile submarines, so its submarines that can launch nuclear weapons, were giving China an operational sea-based deterrent for the first time. China's expanded the size of that fleet, I think, to 6 boats, and it's upgraded some of them to make them quieter, but also equip them with a longer range submarine-launched ballistic missile, the JL-3. But it's still, I think, a bit of an open debate whether that missile can hit the continental United States without departing China's coastal waters. At the theater level, I guess one of the other changes is China now has a particularly accurate intermediate range ballistic missile, so one that has been dubbed the Guam killer in its conventional mission, certainly called the DF-26. And at the intercontinental range, there has also been some important changes in the diversity. China's fielding a new ICBM called the DF-41. It can carry multiple warheads, so it's MIRVed. It has silo, rail, and road mobile basing modes, and it's also more accurate than earlier ICBMs. But the kind of other really big, headline grabbers when it comes to China's diversifying nuclear arsenal are the fact that it's constructed 3 large missile silo fields in its hinterland. Each looks like it's got about 100 silos. And US officials actually recently stated that it was beginning to fill them. This is important because it's a major departure from what China's nuclear sort of force development had previously been doing, which is really moving more towards mobility of its forces as the way that they would survive an adversary's attempt to destroy them, to looking at sort of, I guess, size in that manner. The other, I think, headline grabber was that back in 2021, China tested a fractional orbital bombardment system. So this is a system that's launched into space and does a partial orbit before returning to Earth, paired with a hypersonic missile. And that set off a lot of fears in Washington about China's ability to evade US early warning systems. So two other changes I'll go through quickly, and I know there's a lot in this modernization package, but these two I think get a little bit less attention. One is the increasing accuracy of China's forces, but I think this is an important feature because more accurate forces can reduce collateral damage, and thus they're good for limited strikes. They're also better for targeting military forces, including an adversary's nuclear forces in a counterforce strike. So accuracy sort of, I think, deserves quite a bit more attention than it's getting. China's DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile, the one that I already mentioned, and the DF-41 ICBM, the newest ICBM, are both more accurate than their predecessors. But the accuracy improvements, it's sort of questionable whether they're intentional or intended to enhance some sort of different nuclear mission, because the DF-26 is also a conventional strike system for which accuracy is really, really important. And the DF-41 accuracy has been suggested to me that it's more a result of technological improvements rather than the pursuit of some particular type of new mission like nuclear counterforce. Finally, China's nuclear forces are being kept at a higher state of readiness than previously. China used to keep its warheads and delivery systems separated in peacetime, so it had a very recessed nuclear posture. But the Pentagon has reported that since about 2016, the PLA rocket force, the force that operates China's land-based nuclear forces, has begun to keep a portion of its land-based force on a higher state of alert, so actually conducting deterrent patrols. China's also fielded an early warning system that's by no means perfect, but involves both satellites, so a space component, and ground-based radars. And together with China's silo-based missile forces, the Pentagon is speculating that this change in readiness and the early warning system are part of China's efforts to shift towards having the capability to launch its nuclear forces upon the warning or notice of an incoming nuclear attack. So that would also be a really important step, but as yet unclear whether China has adopted that alert status. So that's pretty much how I evaluate the program.
Thanks for that super useful overview, Fiona. You really got us up to speed when it comes to size, diversity, accuracy, and readiness as sort of the defining characteristics of that modernization. Let's talk a little bit about the why, the motivations here. I mean, a lot has been written about this. In the United States, what are some of the prevailing assumptions that are held by different constituencies that look at this problem set about what is motivating the Chinese in terms of this nuclear breakout? And what's your take on these assumptions? Do you think they're correct, or what's your views?
So I think that there are a range of motivations that various US experts and commentators have pointed to. I've had conversations with some Chinese experts as well who have also speculated or given informed assessments of what they think is driving the modernization, including in writing. And I think there's more evidence for some of the speculated motivations than others. So I'll go through a couple of them. I think that on the US side, probably the biggest concern is that China is moving away from a nuclear strategy or nuclear posture that's geared towards retaliating for an adversary's nuclear strike, and that China is now starting to think about developing a posture that would enable it to credibly threaten nuclear first use, and that it might do that to gain coercive leverage in a conventional conflict, and in particular with the Taiwan contingency and tensions there being front of mind. But also perhaps that China could be encouraged to think about this possibility by what Russia, in particular Putin, has done in relying on nuclear signaling in Ukraine. The other, I think, big concern on the US side is that China is going to replicate the Soviet model of great power nuclear competition. And now that it's locked in this kind of superpower struggle with the United States, it's going to seek either parity with the United States, or it may even make its own bid for nuclear superiority. So having a nuclear force that could really threaten components of the US nuclear arsenal as well. So I think these are important questions to ask and to really look carefully at China's nuclear programs, and to see if, is there evidence that China is actually going down either of these two roads, or perhaps both at once. I don't see, as an analyst, a lot of support for either of these options. I do think that China's capabilities enable it to make more credible threats of nuclear first use than it could have done so previously, but I don't think that its nuclear capabilities are yet optimized for credible first use threats. So for that, it might want to delegate more authorities to military officers or commanders. Currently, it has to be an order from the Politburo Standing Committee, so China's top political decision-making body, as well as its top military decision-making body, to alert, let alone use nuclear weapons. So you can sort of imagine things China could do to make those threats more credible. Another is abandoning its declaratory policy of no first use, that hopefully we can talk a little bit more about later on in the conversation. I also don't see a lot of evidence of China going Soviet in its views of the nuclear balance, or in the capabilities that it is pursuing, because to my mind, the only capability change recently that China could only use for a kind of counterforce nuclear strategy or set of operations are the accuracy improvements to its intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Everything else has a legitimate kind of application in strengthening parts of its retaliatory capability. So turning to, if it's not those two pieces, what is going on here? I think that the two most likely strategic motivations for China to be pursuing its modernization have much more robust support in the Chinese language literature. One is that China is responding to US capabilities developments, that the US has been gradually improving missile defense capabilities. It's pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, which allows it to do more with conventional strike capabilities than previously. It's been improving its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities that could track moving targets like China's land-based nuclear missiles that are road mobile, driving around in its hinterland. Also, the US has invested in non-strategic nuclear weapons since the Trump administration with the supplemental capabilities. All of those, I think, are prompting China to think about how it needs to change its nuclear forces to ensure the same level of kind of robust deterrence as it might have had a decade ago. So I think this is a really strong explanation, but to me, it's actually not the only reason. In my assessment, I think that PRC concerns about these US capabilities developments have gone up gradually, but its modernization has accelerated dramatically. So there's still like a gap there somewhere that we need to fill in with something else. A second strategic explanation that I think has legs is that China is seeking a stronger nuclear capability as a way of entrenching a stalemate with the US. Whether to enable its own conventional attacks on Taiwan, or to prevent the US from relying on its nuclear superiority in a future crisis across the Taiwan Straits. On the PRC side, we tend to see, I think, quite a lot of concern about capricious US behavior that is backed by a belief in its nuclear superiority, and that might give it leverage against China. So you sort of see these stability-instability paradox arguments, but with slightly different spins on them, depending upon whether you're looking from the US or the PRC side. I'll just point to two final things, which are kind of what I would call non-strategic explanations, because I think there's some evidence to support them as well. Tong Zhao, one of my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, just yesterday did a launch for an important report which lays out evidence that basically one of the reasons why China is seeking a stronger nuclear arsenal is because it wants political leverage. This isn't like coercive leverage or military leverage. That China's looking to this nuclear capability to try and get the US to accept China's rise, not just in the military areas, but in non-military areas as well. I've certainly seen evidence of a narrower kind of political leverage motivation in the Chinese language literature. This idea that a bigger arsenal is going to give China leverage in a Taiwan dispute, even if it isn't necessarily going to make China's nuclear arsenal more survivable. So it's looking to that kind of psychological rather than the military impact of more capability. Finally, I think analysts have argued that Xi Jinping has different beliefs about nuclear weapons than other top leaders. And I think this appears to be true because it would be very difficult to get a campaign for modernization of this scale through a top leader in China if they didn't have a slightly different take on how things should go compared to Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin before Xi. But we don't have a lot of evidence of how he actually thinks about nuclear weapons. But there are clearly, I think, some changes in which domestic actors in China are influential over nuclear decision-making. And so it's hard to know whether that's coming from where the leader is looking for advice or whether the changes in who is advising the leader may be driving changes in the leader's beliefs. So I'll leave it there. There's probably other explanations too, but those are my best guesses.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you, Fiona. I do want to come back for 1 second to the first factor that you examined, this notion that the Chinese might be trying to move to a nuclear posture that embraces nuclear first use, and ask you about Chinese diplomacy and how that squares with that purported move towards first use, because we do have this Chinese diplomatic initiative, which has gained a bit more steam again this year in the summer with the NPT PrepCom towards a no first use treaty that is to be negotiated. That is something that the Chinese seem to be pushing at the moment, that they seem to be quite vocal about. And so I'm curious, in light of everything that you just said in terms of what's driving Chinese modernization, how do you read that Chinese diplomatic initiative for a no first use treaty?
So I think it's really significant for two reasons. The first is, I think, as I alluded to earlier, if China was really seeking to maximize the leverage it could get from its nuclear weapons by adopting a first-use nuclear posture, then one of the ways in which it would maximize that leverage is to change its declaratory policy, right? That if you want your adversaries to be terrified that you'll use nuclear weapons, then you certainly don't want them looking at your no first-use policy and thinking that maybe you might hesitate because of that policy. That's not to say, though, that I think the no first use pledge would prevent China from perhaps looking at adopting operational doctrine to threaten nuclear first use, or even something like launch on warning. But I think as long as this declaratory policy remains in effect, then there's going to be an internal argument within China to be made for its operations and its capabilities to be consistent with that policy, as was the case in the past, right? That China's no first use policy, coming down from the top leaders from the 1960s onwards, has always exerted a really strong influence over how China was putting together the operations for actual nuclear weapons use. It's cited extensively in a lot of manuals that we have describing what China's actual nuclear operations would look like. So I think that this diplomatic push to bring no first use not just very strongly out in China's own diplomacy about its own nuclear weapons. Indeed, yesterday was, I think, the 60th anniversary of China's first nuclear test. The spokesman from the Chinese Foreign Ministry used the opportunity to again affirm this no first use policy that had been in place since then. And I think this should therefore give us a little bit of hesitancy about just how likely this possibility is that China is seeking a first use capability. There's at least some friction that's coming from this policy if China's pushing in that direction. But I think the other reason why this diplomatic push is so significant is because it offers us a window into how China might be thinking about arms control, and a window into how China thinks about the rules it wants to see in the broader nuclear order. And while I think there is a general understanding that China is not just accepting the existing rules of the international order as they are, that it has a desire to reshape them to better suit its own interests in areas like international development with the Belt and Road Initiative, the law of the sea, human rights, etc. It's actually been pretty passive in the nuclear domain about proposing new rules. And so I think this is a rare proactive proposal for what those rules might look like. And so therefore, I think it really behooves us to consider it pretty carefully. I think it's noteworthy that China is framing the No First Use Treaty as a disarmament initiative, and that it's doing it in a multilateral fora of the NPT review conference. And cynics might view these two features as kind of good public relations to deflect the attention among non-nuclear weapon states in particular away from China's nuclear modernization, and so wouldn't have the same pressure as Russia and the US to disarm. I mean, I'm sure that that's part of the kind of appeal of putting forward this treaty. But I think multilateralizing no first use has been a really long time objective of both China's diplomats as well as its arms controllers. And I think it kind of cracks open the door to discussions with the US on how to stabilize the nuclear relationship, to at least kind of hear, where is China at? Where is it, what is it thinking about this modernization? The future of a stable relationship with the US might look like.
Fiona, this is so interesting. And you've just been talking about the way that sort of China's diplomacy can give us some insights into maybe what is happening with respect to modernization. I want to get back to its actions and follow up on something you said earlier. I'm thinking here about China's ICBM test that it conducted in late September. That was the first such test in decades, and it obviously garnered significant attention. Analysts have been talking about the nature of that test, the timing, how do we explain that? I wonder what your take is here and what you think we can infer from things like tests with respect to China's underlying motivations for this modernization.
I think it's tricky to infer what's going on, and perhaps my three possible explanations for the test will demonstrate that, because they're pushing in radically different directions. I think the first possibility is that back in January, when the US and China still looked like they might be having some nascent bilateral nuclear arms control talks, US officials were actually proposing a ballistic missile notification regime with China. And they were looking to see whether China would be enthusiastic about that proposal. China then cancelled further iterations of the test, citing US arms sales towards Taiwan. But I think it's really noteworthy that China did actually notify the United States of the test before it occurred. So one possible explanation is, maybe this is an example of China de facto performing that kind of agreement without signing on to a formal memorandum of understanding that would require that. Another possibility, though, is that this could be a form of nuclear signaling to China's adversaries, especially the United States, to show that it has the capability and the will to use its nuclear capabilities when called on to do so. I think some analysts have pointed out there is a leaked missile forces manual that now is 2 decades old, The Science of Second Artillery Campaigns, but nevertheless is one of the most probative sources that we have about China's nuclear campaigns and how they'd actually be executed. And so that volume had a chapter in it that sort of talks about nuclear deterrent signaling. One of the lesser included steps in that ladder of signaling is actually to conduct test launches. And the reason that you conduct test launches in that manual is to signal to an enemy that you have capability, to signal that you have the will to actually carry out nuclear strikes, and to deter the enemy from engaging in nuclear threats. So obviously there wasn't a clear trigger, at least that I'm aware of, for China to say, hey, we really need to signal hard against the United States. But that's another way in which we can sort of understand what China is up to. The final possibility, I think, as some analysts have speculated, is that China's rocket forces have had a bit of a rocky year. Some of the top rocket force leaders have been removed from their posts, and in doing so, there have been a lot of news reports raising questions about things like quality control and corruption in the missile forces that could cast both foreign as well as internal doubt on whether or not China's missile forces can actually carry out their mission. Do the missiles actually work, right? And so this may have created pressures on China's leaders and on the PLA, on the rocket force, to go about demonstrating that capability, to prove to themselves, prove to the rest of the PLA, prove to the Chinese people, prove to China's adversaries and broader audiences that their missiles are not proverbially full of water. So with those three explanations, even if I think the Chinese spokesperson had clearly said it was one of these three, I think we would all be looking to see, well, is this a de facto ballistic missile notification regime underway? But really, is this nuclear signaling to tell the US to sort of back off? Or is this so even if we got kind of clear signals from up on top, it would be very difficult to disentangle which one of these motivations is the real reason, when in fact it actually might be all three at the same time. So I think this is one of the reasons why behavior can be particularly tricky to draw inferences from. This is a costly signal, but we don't really know what cost China is looking to pay in the kind of political science lexicon.
Tricky to disentangle. It's a perfect segue to my next question, because I wanted to pivot a little bit to how we study this problem, the problem set of Chinese nuclear modernization. And perhaps you can help us understand a little bit some of the challenges that you encounter as a scholar when you look at China modernizing in an environment where I'd imagine doing in-country research is pretty difficult. Speaking with Chinese scholars, let alone government officials, about these issues is pretty difficult. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. And to add to that question, you wrote in a piece in Arms Control Today, I think last year, that, I quote, "Analyzing just the capabilities that China is developing raises as many questions as it answers." So perhaps you could also talk a little bit about how an approach that focuses on capabilities could steer observers in the wrong direction. And then if that is the case, then what's the antidote to that in the current environment?
Yeah, great questions. And quoting back my own words at me was encourages me to be scrupulous in defending my choice of words. And so to do so, I'm going to lean on the classical scholarship on the security dilemma. And so, I mean, trained as a political scientist, I had, I think, Robert Jervis's Perception and Misperception in International Politics and Cooperation Under the Security Dilemma is these kinds of keywords inculcated into my environment from very early on, and they remain influential for how I think about these issues. And I think that the pitfalls of inferring intentions from capabilities are really well articulated in this literature on the security dilemma, where, the Jervis and others point to the fact that arming by one country for defensive purposes is interpreted as arming for offensive purposes by their adversaries. And this becomes especially intense when the capabilities that they're using to arm can be used either offensively or defensively. So as my breakdown of the kind of attributes of China's nuclear modernization hopefully demonstrated, sometimes it is possible to infer possible uses from capabilities, like what can you use for retaliation versus first use. But a lot of the capabilities that I went through can kind of be used for both. So, you're getting really to this point of like, of the capabilities sort of being used for both retaliation and first use as kind of the proxies for defensive and offensive arming. But also it's worth noting that even retaliatory capabilities can sometimes be used to engage in aggressive behaviors and non-status quo oriented behaviors, and that's what a lot of the kind of the stability-instability paradox types of explanations for China's nuclear modernization are getting at, that even if China is doing this just to get a more robust retaliatory capability, this can enable it to do more things at the conventional level, including the use of aggression. So looking at the capabilities, I think, gets tricky for those reasons. But one thing I will point out is previously, and this might seem like a bit of a contradiction, previously, a lot of the attributes of China's nuclear arsenal did actually seem to support only retaliatory uses. So it was tiny. It was, in that kind of low 200s, mid 200s in terms of size, kept at a very low state of readiness. So with the warheads and missiles kept separate in peacetime and requiring a top level leadership order in order to mate them. and had these retaliatory only operational doctrines. So there are some times when you can sort of look at a capability and say, look, it's not going to prevent China from engaging in first use, but that's a kind of bad bet if they were to use nuclear weapons first with a tiny arsenal that left them with very little options henceforth if they engaged in a sort of continuing tit for tat of the use of nuclear weapons. So anyway, hopefully that touches a little bit on the look beyond the capabilities, because they can only tell you so much, and it raises these questions then of how should we interpret the same capability that could be used either for first use or for retaliation, for competition or for something else. And I think that the answer here goes to getting at this question of motivations. So we talked a little bit earlier about the why, and to me, the why is really the place where we need to be looking if we want to understand what China is doing. And for that reason, being able to study the why is really important, but it's also really difficult, as your question pointed out. I've been fortunate that I have actually been able to return to China and conduct some expert interviews to, gather some additional Chinese language materials over the years. So it's certainly difficult, but it is not as difficult as it was during the COVID period. I think there are more expert exchanges now between Chinese and Western scholars, so there are other opportunities to sort of get at some of these motivations. But I'd add that the expert interviews are probative, but they're not dispositive. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we face as researchers right now is trying to understand the views of two domestic constituencies in China that are very, very difficult to get at. One is the top leader. I think if we had a good understanding of how Xi Jinping thought about the utility of nuclear weapons in the same way as we can look at Mao Zedong's writings and understand very clearly how he thought about nuclear weapons capabilities, then that would go a long way to helping us understand which of those, many options in the why bucket are the most important. The second is to get the military's views, and while I think we can guess at, how they would select the most, autonomy or resource or enhancing options, it's still tricky to find out what is it that the rocket force, but more importantly, the PLA Navy that operates the sea-based nuclear forces, or the PLA Air Force. We just have very, very little insight into what the other services conducting nuclear operations think about this set of capabilities and how they're interacting with the rocket forces, which traditionally sort of determined a lot of how China's nuclear doctrine was operated and functioned. And so we sort of have a trickier time figuring out what they're thinking and how much influence they have over decision making. And they're the areas that you can ask and you can try and read their newspapers, etc. But getting getting confidence in what those groups think is tricky at this stage.
Fiona, you were talking about sort of this dilemma when it comes to figuring out what is an offensive weapon, what is a defensive weapon, what is a first strike weapon, what is a second strike capability, which leads me to my next question, which deals with the nuclear balance. So, in your scholarship, you look at Chinese understandings of the nuclear balance as either delicate or robust. Can you help us take a step back here and understand what the nuclear balance is, and tell us what we know about how Chinese strategists are thinking about the state of that balance and the ways in which we know that? And then I guess as kind of a follow-up to that question, why does that matter when it comes to understanding China's nuclear modernization? You've hinted at that, but I wonder if you can help us understand a little bit better.
Sure. So I think I'll step back for 1 second and talk a little bit about where this concept of the nuclear balance with these terms fragile and robust is coming from, because we might just think the nuclear balance is they have this many and they have that many, and who wins kind of thing, or no one wins, and that's the whole point of MAD. But I'm really drawing in some of my scholarship on some of the recent literature by scholar Brendan Rittenhouse-Green, who's a professor at the University of Cincinnati, wrote a book called The Revolution That Failed, analyzing the Cold War arms race, which has always been one of these challenges to theories of the nuclear revolution that say basically once two countries have a secure second strike capability, then that is going to pacify the international system and remove a lot of these competitive pressures, because military victory is no longer possible. So Green uses this term of the delicate nuclear balance to describe the perception among the two superpowers during the Cold War that firstly, even small technological changes could have a big impact on both countries' ability to assure destruction. So, let's say I develop a new cruise missile of some description, or I developed some aspect of missile defenses, that this is going to have a really significant impact on whether I can feel secure that I can still hold you at risk if you decide to attack me first with nuclear weapons. The second aspect that Green pointed to that makes the nuclear balance delicate is that an adversary might say, you know what, I reject the notion of MAD. I don't actually think nuclear weapons have this impact on international politics. I'm going to continue along like we're still in a conventional world. And that makes it difficult, Green argues, for that country to actually deter an adversary that's not operating from the same assumptions about the impact of nuclear weapons. So Green argued that these delicate views were a major driver of the Cold War arms competition, and they're in contrast to what I call the robust view of the nuclear balance, which is reflective of these more traditional theories that MAD has this pacifying impact. So, for example, scholars who really lean on this concept of MAD are much more dismissive of these small technological changes in the nuclear balance, and they tend to view an adversary's acceptance of MAD as being somewhat irrelevant to how you should think about pursuing your own nuclear forces. So I used this kind of lens when China's nuclear modernization took off, because it coincided with this strategic competition framework dominating US-China relations, to try and see if actually China was shifting to this more kind of delicate view of the nuclear balance, and hence if we're on the cusp of a nuclear arms race that looked much more similar to the Cold War, that in many ways was driven by this superpower competition as a kind of scope condition for this delicate nuclear balance. What I found, though, is really not a lot of evidence among China's expert strategist community that the nuclear balance was delicate. They definitely perceived threats to China's retaliatory capability from US counterforce developments, whether that might be putting more ground-based interceptors, improving their ISR capabilities, etc. But they didn't look at those things and say, well, we're not going to be able to counter those capabilities by simply building up more nuclear forces. And they certainly didn't say, well, we're going to need parity, or we're going to need counterforce capabilities in order to deal with this threat posed by these US technological challenge. Experts, though, were not the only ones who have a voice in China's nuclear decision-making, so I also looked a little bit at China's capabilities to see if the capabilities could tell us anything different about what China might be pursuing. But China's nuclear acquisitions, to me, look more responsive to some of these US capabilities, but they still don't look anything like the Soviet arsenal. They don't look anything like one that, to me, is looking like the US arsenal as well. But I do caveat this by saying that China's nuclear modernization is starting from such a low base in terms of being very small, very inaccurate, quite not diverse, as little as 5 years ago, that it's going to need a bigger arsenal just to kind of entrench mutually assured destruction with the United States. And only once it achieves that MAD capability can we then, I think, with confidence say that it either is or isn't going beyond what's needed to entrench MAD to actually go and seek an equally large or even nuclear superiority vis-a-vis the United States, and hence reflect these kind of fragile ideas of the nuclear balance. So it's sort of a little bit too early to tell, but the science thus far, certainly in the expert views, suggest China hasn't gone Soviet just yet in its views of the nuclear balance, or US as well, I should say. I think the US very much adopts this fragile mentality to the nuclear balance.
Thanks for that, Fiona. We're approaching the end of our conversation, and so I do want to come a little bit to the policy implications of everything we discussed today. We talked about what it is that China is doing, and we've talked about considerable ambivalence as to the why, the potential Chinese motivations. And you wrote in that piece that I already cited last year in Arms Control Today that until the goals of China's nuclear modernization are better understood, I quote, the US should avoid the temptation to assume the worst about China's motivations and proceed with caution in its policy responses to avoid a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, reading this, I sort of thought, well, obviously the thing that one should try to do here is to better understand the motivations, to enter dialogue with the Chinese to get a better sense of what it is that they're after. But as an outsider, someone who doesn't really study China, it seems to me that the Chinese have somewhat complicated that effort by the United States to better understand motivations, because they have declined to meet with US officials to talk about nuclear arms control, at least from what I've picked up in the press on the issue. So given that China makes it hard to understand motivations, what is it that you would concretely advise the United States try to do here?
This is such a difficult issue. This is one of those issues where I say, my goodness, I'm glad I'm an academic and not a practitioner, because this is just such a tough nut to crack. I think that there are a couple of things that the United States can sort of do in this instance. And I think the broad brush recommendation that understanding why China is doing what it's doing and what its end goals are should really inform the US decision-making on how it proceeds with things like the size of its own arsenal, et cetera. And, again, understanding that people who sit in the chair and make those decisions sometimes can't wait for all the information they want, especially with the new START expiration deadline sort of looming on the horizon. But nevertheless, here are a couple of things that I would recommend that policymakers do to try to get a better sense of what China is up to and why. I think, first of all, some scholars, and here I think Tong Zhao has been very vocal in articulating this recommendation, that the political relationship really dictates China's willingness to discuss nuclear issues. And I think that's correct. That when you see, generally speaking, that when Xi Jinping and Joe Biden can have a summit and things go smoothly, there aren't balloons flying over, the ICBM fields of the Midwest in the United States, then China and the United States have had the ability to sometimes have discussions about nuclear issues, whether, in standalone forms like happened last, I think October, but also bound into other types of dialogues that leaders might be having. And I think that when the political relationship is in a place where the US and China can talk directly with each other about some of those issues, where the US can communicate what its concerns are, even if China doesn't answer them, or sometimes perhaps, China does answer these questions. It's very hard to tell what happens behind closed doors. But that whenever those opportunities are there, the United States should push for them and take full advantage of them. But I don't think that the United States should expect that those channels are always going to be available. So in the instance that they do come up, use them to the fullest, but don't expect that you're going to have a sort of steady, consistent channel going forward. And the reason for this is that, I have to say that I'm not convinced that China's decision makers believe that a dialogue is actually necessary to achieve crisis or arms race stability with China. I think that there are strong constituencies within China, especially among the arms control community, that sees just how important these conversations are. But I am not sure that the leadership level sees these things as being important. But there are other opportunities when the bilateral channel is not available, through which the US can continue to gain information to, draw attention to what China is doing. And one of those is to engage multilaterally. So, for example, this NPT review conference proposal about no first use. I mean, ask China. How is this going to work? How is it going to be verified? What does no first use mean? Is it consistent with launch on warning? There's a whole bunch of questions that this proposal can sort of bring up. And China has generally always been a little bit more responsive to discussions on nuclear matters when they're in a multilateral fora, because the power imbalances are perhaps not as severe. And the optics are a little bit different when you're in a multilateral forum than when you're in a bilateral forum about what the purpose of the engagement actually happens to be. So that's the sort of second way of, like, if China cuts off the bilateral, you can still try and elicit information using the proposals China's put on the table. The third thing that I would recommend, is the way forward is to really push expert engagement wherever possible. There are a lot of things that track 2 dialogues and the conversations on the side of them can bring out in terms of eliciting information. I think that those sorts of processes were underway up until, I think, about 2017, 2018. And to my knowledge, I think in a really full-blown sense, track 1.5 discussions on these issues haven't restarted. But there are a lot of track 2s that I think have restarted and continue to elicit useful information. And they also require Chinese participants to actually come to the table and to have something to say. And in order to have something to say, they have to have spoken to their own government to get a sense of, what is the lay of the land? What's the nature of the policy? What can they say in this public forum? What messages does the government want to come across? And then I think the final piece is that in the US perspective, this is less about reducing nuclear risks, but more in a sort of crisis signaling piece, is to think about public signaling. Because if, your adversary will not speak to you in a direct channel, I mean, China announced that it was engaging in this ballistic missile launch, did so publicly. And so how can you use these sort of unilateral public channels to also signal certain types of information to China if kind of crisis stability discussions that yield more direct and private channels are not forthcoming? So really sort of thinking in a layered sense, from the official to the unofficial, from the private to the public, and just really having an all hands on deck approach to trying to get as much information out, but also to signal to China, like, what is the US going to do in terms of the options it has on the table.
Fiona, you teed up perfectly our next question, which I'm so sorry to say is our last question, because this has been so interesting. You mentioned, track 1.5, track 2 engagement, which makes me think about the interactions between the sort of scholarly expert community and the practitioner communities. One question we always ask our guests is how to more effectively bridge that gap. So I wonder, within your specific area of research, what do you think could be done to facilitate more productive engagement between scholars and practitioners? And where would that be the most needed in sort of the China portfolio?
So this is a great question. And as I sat down to sort of like think about it, if I sit here and sort of consider, one of the things I will say that I'm pleased to report is that I do think that government actors, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, actually really do understand the value of scholarship on issues to do with China's nuclear capabilities. And so, I've been pleased to see some of those communities engage with the work that I have done, often when it does not comport with sometimes the public signaling on how people understand China. So at the very least, if people maybe don't agree with it, or it's against the sort of broader policy, they are taking in ideas that are going to challenge perhaps some of those perceptions. So I think that's definitely a plus in terms of a smaller gap to bridge perhaps than might be otherwise be the case. But I think there are sort of 2 other pieces where I would point to a need for bridging the gap. And I think one is to think a little bit more about how broader government policies about competing with China can restrict opportunities for engagement, both at the government and at the expert level. And this can come down to everything from funding for dialogues on the Chinese side, onto permissions for participation, and onto that suite of sort of movement restrictions, if you like, that can get in the way of those face-to-face options, which are often the most productive in terms of generating insights, not just between experts from the Chinese and the US side, but also between experts and policymakers on the one side. and also between experts on the Chinese side and US government actors to sort of see who are the people who are writing op-eds or writing articles that they might otherwise be consuming to sort of engage with them in that manner. But I think perhaps the biggest gap to bridge at this point is that often some of the assumptions that policymakers and sort of policy commentators, I might say, because there's been so little information from China about what's going on with its nuclear modernization, I think there are a lot of sort of preconceived notions of what China is doing have become conventional wisdoms. And that has really raised the evidentiary bar to shift those entrenched perceptions. And often it takes, or there's a demand for a lot more evidence to shift the perception than to justify that perception in the first place. And if there's one lesson that all of my research and my dozen years of sort of doing field work within China on nuclear related issues has taught me, is that mirror imaging is perhaps the biggest pitfall that we can engage in trying to understand China's behavior. I think it's a good starting point to sometimes say, what did the Soviets do? What does the US do? What do other actors that might share attributes with China do? But China is, it is not an emulator. It is also not the kind of country that does everything with Chinese characteristics with some sort of mystical wisdom that we cannot understand. It sits between those two bookends, and what we really need to try to understand is like, what are the drivers of how China picks and chooses different types of policy options? And we therefore shouldn't expect that China is going to do things exactly the same as the US or the Soviet Union. And really study it in its own rights to try and shift some of those perceptions. And I'll close just by saying that I think, Tong Zhao's recent report on China's nuclear modernization, which is front of mind because we did an event on it yesterday, but I think this is a really good example of taking China on its own terms and finding that it actually does things that help us understand broader international relations and state behavior better, because sometimes we just don't think that, a country could think of its nuclear weapons for this purpose. And if you don't look at China and you mirror image or you borrow from historical analogies, you're never going to kind of see it. So that would be my kind of long-winded suggestion for bridging the gap is to start with an open mind when it comes to thinking about China and apply the same evidentiary standards to the analogies, the historical lessons, the mirror imaging as you do to that's unusual and weird and experimental, but it can make sense in China's instance.
Fiona, what a great note to end on. This has been such a fascinating conversation. As someone, Hannah alluded to this earlier, I'm not a sinologist myself, but I have learned so much from not only this discussion, but also your work more broadly, which I admire so much. So thank you very, very much for making the time to be with us. And that'll do it. We'll close this out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really, really fun to talk.